Good day, everyone. Arsen Malola here, and welcome to this screencast where we will be covering the second accounting task in the March 2022 APC exam. In the screencast, the style that we're going to be taking is going to be very similar to the first screencast we did for task A, where we'll be going over the pre-release information as pertained to the specific email or document that relates to the second accounting task, which ended up being task D. Now, the second accounting task was a highly integrated task, and it included both elements of management accounting and finance and accounting. So in this screencast, we're going to be focusing on the accounting elements of the task. Now, needless to say that when you are reading the pre-release information in your own right, it's very important that you keep a multidisciplinary view, right? But we are purposefully, at least in this scenario, we're going to be speaking about the other elements, but focusing primarily on the accounting element of the task. And then Rendani will come and overlay this discussion with the management, accounting, and finance aspects of the task, and he'll include his own comments in this in this very email, giving you the best of both worlds and in terms of thinking from a multidisciplinary perspective. Now, as with the first screencast, if you haven't already, or the first screencast for task A, if you haven't already, please pause this video and read the email at least once, right? So from a reading and unpacking the pre-release information perspective, it's important that you first read all the information once, get a high level bird's eye view of what is needed, right, to direct your thinking, and then you come back and read it again, unpacking each sentence in a lot of detail, right? So go ahead and pause if you haven't already and give the email a read and pick out anything that you need to pick out, directions, triggers, negative triggers, all of that stuff. Please go ahead. Cool. I'm hoping that you have managed to read the pre-release information, and you would have seen from the bottom of this email that there's a very direct ask or trigger that's bringing up accounting in this email. All right. So with that context, with that additional context of where this task is going or where this email is going, we're going to then continue reading this with that accounting angle. Okay, and speak to the other disciplines as well. So another email from Susan to yourself as a senior financial analyst. Subject of the email is funding options. Hi again. Another important aspect to consider regarding our expansion into Africa is how we're going to fund it all, right? So again, or not again, it's the first time I'm saying this, but this should now make you start thinking about considering funding, right? So a very clear direction in which this email is going. And it's going to the extent of, okay, cool, we need to fund our expansion. Now, in your mind at a very high level, should be coming through all the different options in terms of funding, right? All bedded down, or the foundation rather, is either your own cash resources, debt funding, or equity funding. Traditionally, obtaining funding for new academic institution is not easy given the asset intensity of our business. Banks are reluctant to invest in these businesses. This is a challenge for the entire industry and not unique to Limpros. Okay, so very important context here that we're being given about the industry, right? Asset intensive, so massive investments in the beginning for typical educational companies, whereas the revenue trickles in, right? Because usually you start small, you don't really have like a big bang sort of revenue generation or profitability, right? It represents more of a J curve, right? They call it a J curve in this industry, whereby in the initial years you could even be loss making because you haven't yet reached critical mass, and in a point where it comes back where you hit break even, and then because most of the costs are fixed, as you grow sort of the capacity and the number of candidates in your institution, everything, that contribution just boosts your ultimate bottom line. So something that's very common in this industry, most investments in new education institutions have that J curve effect, right? You can Google it just to have it if you haven't already come across the concept when you're doing your industry research. The board has discussed but decided against listing Limpros on the JSE to raise funds through an initial public offering, right? So one element of probably getting some equity funding is to list, but the board has said, okay, we're not going to go that route. As such, a move would have a big governance implications at a board level. Rather, we have approached Africa Capital Partners, an established private equity and venture capital institution, to consider investing in our expansion, right? So another option to get that funding could be from a private equity entity who typically invest either equity or debt and or both. But typically, it's almost like a combination of both equity and debt. ACP offers a broad range of products to prospective clients and partners. Its offerings include typical loan funding and direct equity investments. So those are the two options. ACP has been in operation since 1997 and is a level 1 triple BE contributor headquartered in Johannesburg. Right? So we're getting a little bit of a profile of the potential parties that will be co-investing into Limpros, which is very important, right? You always want to have co-investors if you're going to bring in equity investors that share the same values, that will bring something to the table in terms of growing the company, right? Typically, if you want to bring an equity participant in, you want to try avoid just making it be a money transaction, right? You want strategic shareholders are most opportune. Its existing portfolio investment consists of assets under management in excess of $100 million, so about 1.7 billion rands. Its strategic objective is to grow assets under management by 50 million over the next 24 months. These funds have been earmarked for investments across the African continent, right? So a very quite a large fund. Maybe not very big from an international context, but locally, 1.7 billion assets under management is quite large. And they're also in a growth strategy, right? So they've got a lot of capital that they need to deploy. Therefore, Limpros could be an opportune or a great way to deploy that capital. Okay, but again, from a management, accounting, and finance perspective, a lot more to unpack here. But we're going to be focusing on the accounting elements. And at this point, there isn't anything particularly that we can say sticks out as an accounting thing that we need to be thinking about. Initial indications by ACP are that it may be willing to offer us a USD denominated term loan at a fair interest rate linked to SOFR secured overnight financing rate, right? So SOFR replaced LIBOR. LIBOR is like JIBOR, right? So it's a reference rate, right? But if you're not sure what SOFR is, go ahead and Google it, right? You have the ability during the 5 days. Don't get sucked into the technicalities of it all because it's quite a technical concept or a technical reference rate to calculate. But just the fact that it's a reference rate is all you needed, right? So typically, interest rate will be at a reference rate plus some sort of margin. Okay, and from a management, accounting, and finance perspective, again, I'm not going to go into too much details on that element. USD denominated loan linked to SOFR, we're a South African denominated company, right? All those FX risk considerations come into play. However, from an accounting perspective, right, because I'm thinking about a few things, okay? So if we're obtaining a loan, I'm hoping we are thinking about sort of IFRS 9, right? Financial liabilities are at amortized cost, right? Those will be amortized costs unless they're designated fair value through profit and loss, which is not evident in this particular scenario, and it's a foreign currency loan. And balance, and this is a monetary item, so you can do your research, therefore would have IAS 21 consequences, right? So this is the type of thing that you need to be, foreign exchange differences consideration. So this is the type of thing that you need to be thinking about when you read something like this, when you have your accounting hat on, right? Both the IFRS 9 angle of it, okay, and also the fact that it's a foreign loan, therefore we're going to have some foreign exchange differences also coming through. Okay, so in your research, be sure to, again, in a table format, I much prefer table format. On the left-hand side, you have all the requirements of IFRS 9, starting from, and when I speak about all the requirements from IFRS 9, right, you need to have the definitions, right? So apply the definition. Yes, it's straightforward, right? But do it in your research. Left-hand side, have the definition of financial liability, right? And the most important bit is that a contractual obligation to pay cash. And then go ahead and apply it in this context, right? In this context, it would be definitely met, right? So it's quite easy to meet, right? Then you flip into IFRS 9. So definitions, remember, sit in IS 32. Okay. Recognition, right? Which is quite simple, right? When we enter into the contract. Then initial measurement, which again is quite simple, right? It's at fair value. Then subsequent measurement, right? As mentioned, amortized cost, Alex designated, but doesn't seem to be the case, right? You can just think about derecognition, not really applicable here, nothing showing us that we could have sort of concerns in terms of derecognition, but also presentation and disclosure, right? Now, presentation disclosure requirements in IFRS 7 is quite onerous. It's quite a big standard, and you would expect that if this is something that the examiner wants you to have a look at, they would trigger it very specifically, right? Because it's a lot, right? But just very high level, just thinking about it should not sort of waste your time too much, right? So on the left hand side, you have all these requirements. On the left hand side, you have all the requirements. Right hand side, apply to the extent that you can. Same thing with IS 21, right? This is a foreign currency transaction, right? Because it meets the definition of one. It's a monetary item because it meets the definition of one. We're going to have FX differences. They go to P&L. You can even have like, if you need some journal entries as well to illustrate how it will all work in your research, right? So try and apply the technical concepts in as much as possible. And as you do this, you now also can create expectations, right? I was going to say exchange rates, but remember with exchange rates, at least the current exchange rate, you can just Google that. But if we need to know some historic exchange rates, right, would have to be given that information. So where you have gaps in your application, so you can't really apply a principle because you don't have the information, then make a note for yourself, right? And then consider, if I get this information, what would my conclusion be? If I get that information, what would my conclusion change to, or what would my conclusion be, right? So in other words, you, like we spoke in the first screencast, you generating that expectation of the information you expect to receive. Therefore, when you get it, it's not a surprise. And furthermore, if you get it and it's not in line with the expectation, you can question it. If you don't get it, you can ask for it, or you can say, we need this information, right? That all is part and parcel of that awesome C outcome, or even an HC. Any investment for which these funds are used will need to maintain a specific debt service coverage ratio, which we expect to be communicated to us in the term sheet. Okay. Now, again, if this is the debt covenant, if you're not comfortable with what the debt service coverage ratio is, Google it, right? Go on Google and get a definition of it, right? You see it's a ratio. Sometimes it's based on EBITDA. Sometimes it's based on operating cash flows over the debt, the interest, and your capital repayments. Now, again, right? It can be one of those two. The numerator or the one bit of the formula can either be EBITDA or operating cash flows. There could be some discussion in terms of which one's better, which one works better when, right? So have that in your research as well, and consider it in this context, which one may be better. But again, that's going to be covered in more detail when you do the management, accounting, and finance bits of this email. ACP, Africa Capital Partners, has also expressed an interest in to possibly make an equity investment in the African operations. The idea is that a new company will be set up to hold the Africa operations, excluding South Africa. Limpros and APC will then hold shares in the new formed company, NewCo. All right, let's stop there. So we are the different proposals. We can either do the debt option, the foreign debt, USD debt, or we can do this other option that would see a new company called NewCo incorporated that will hold all the Africa operations, and Limpros and ACP will both hold shares in the newly formed company. Okay. Now, in the context of an accounting trigger, right, which becomes very clear in the following sentences. Let's have a look at the statement, right? So incorporating a new entity and investing in this new entity. The key concern here would be the classification of the investment in shares, right? It can either be a subsidiary, it can be a joint venture, it can be an associate, or it can be a fair value investment. Now, and considering these standards or these classifications would be in this specific order. Okay, so your research therefore would need to be quite broad to cover all of these aspects or all of these elements, right? To research this in an accounting context, right? But and also be very careful when you perform your research, because you could find yourself in a position where you don't consider enough. Okay, so for instance, if when considering whether or not the investment in Newco is a subsidiary of Limpros, we would need to consider the control definition in IFRS 10, right? However, that is not the only piece that is required, okay? Because it's not only do we need to if we're going to consolidate a subsidiary, not only do we need to control the investee, but the investee also needs to meet the definition of a business, right? And a definition of a business, there's a new one, right? Plus there's a concentration test that we also need to make sure that we're comfortable with. Now, my view is that if they wanted you to look at the concentration test, it'll probably be a little bit more specific. However, you can't take that chance. So you need to at least at the very high, you need to know the basics of the test, right? You need to know the basics of the new definition of a business, the basics of the concentration test, in order to determine whether or not we have a business, and at the same time, and how the concentration test works, right, with all those options and what all the conclusions mean. And at the same time, we need to revise the definition of control, right? Power, exposure to variable returns, and the link between the two, and all of those concepts in between. Again, IFRS 10 is a massive standard, right? And without being given a lot more guidance here, right? For me personally, I wouldn't go into details in terms of very complex concepts such as asset managers, right? So if you look in the last element of the definition of control, where you have to have the ability to use your power to affect your variable returns, where you're essentially ascertaining whether or not an entity control or has power in the capacity as a principal or an agent. Okay, it goes into a lot of detail about the asset management industry and all the complexities that lie in there. Now, with a statement like this and a trigger that just says accounting implications, you need not go into the more complex elements of a standard. I don't believe you do. However, the basics, the fundamentals of the standard is what you need to make sure that you cover, right? The basic principles. And you can use your ITC syllabus as a guide in terms of ascertaining what the basic principles in a particular standard, which so happens to be a part of your ITC syllabus, are. Okay, so when you get when you don't get that much information in your pre-release information, right? So if you look at task A, for instance, where we had copious amounts of information to consider as part of the trigger, whereas in this task, it's a very high level trigger, very high level information. So our research, we can do very little in terms of applying to the principles in our research, but the most we can do is sort of almost reconsider or revise the principles that sit in the standard. But again, without any specific guidance to the more complex concepts, stick to the fundamental concepts of the standard. Okay, so be careful with this one, the first classification. So two pieces to it. First, you need to consider whether or not the investor, Limpros in this case, has control over the investee, the Newco in this case. And then you need to consider whether Newco meets the definition of a business, right? To determine whether or not IFRS 3 is applicable, and which includes the new definition of a business and the concentration test. And then, of course, going forward, IFRS 10 again, in terms of consolidation procedures. Right? Again, very high level, just revising the principles of performing a consolidation. Joint venture, right? We're looking for joint control. right? And also just considering joint arrangement versus joint operation, right? Again, getting a high level revision of the principles that sit in IFRS 11. It's also scoped inside, essentially, is part and parcel of the research of this task. And then with an associate, IS 28, right? And included in that, I'm going to put it up here as well. We need to learn how to just revise equity accounting, the basics of equity accounting. Okay. And then lastly, fair value investment, IFRS 9. And then we then need to make sure that we're comfortable with the basics of fair value measurement. Right? Classification, rather. Okay. So, a very high level point saying we're worried about the accounting implications of this new investment into NewCo, right? Which sort of alludes to concerns on classification and maybe even measurement. A lot of research to do in terms of just revising the basic principles, because we don't have any specific direction in terms of where this is going to go, right? So without any specific direction, we can't hone in on a specific standard, on a specific principle in the standard. We just need to cover our bases and make sure that our research includes revision of the fundamentals, and we apply to the extent that we can. Okay, but in this case, not much that you would have been able to apply to these principles. However, as an exit strategy, ACP wants to have an option to sell its shares in NewCo after a period of time has lapsed by having a put option against Limpros. Okay, so we have a put option here. Okay, that's exercisable, that's issued by Limpros and held by NewCo. I'm hoping that as soon as you see a put option, the first thing that comes to mind is whether or not this thing is a derivative instrument. Okay, because options are synonymous to derivative instruments from an accounting perspective. Now, it's not to say that all options are always going to be derivatives, but it's important to always have that association. When you say a forward contract, a put option, a call option, typically those could meet the definition of a derivative in IFRS 9. Okay, so again, we've got an option ACP holds an option to put the shares back to, or not even back to put the shares to Limpros at a future date, right, after a period of time. So again, you need to apply the definition to the extent that you can, right? So we're not, as by way of example, right, one of the requirements is that there needs to be little or no consideration, right? We don't have information about whether or not consideration has been charged here. It's silent. Therefore, we just need to note it and say we could get this information on the day. If the consideration is small, okay, one step closer to meeting the definition of a derivative. If it is large, we will not meet the definition of a derivative. Then we need to figure out what type of instrument this is. I'm just going to put the comment here so I remember to sort of come back to it. Okay, and then also what is small? What is considered small? Now, this is that element of or little, right? It says little or no. What is considered little? This is an element of professional judgment that will need to come in, that you need to also start thinking about at an APC level, right? At an ITC level, we'll make it very clear that the consideration is small, right? So no room for judgment, or little room for judgment. APC level, you need to be able to identify the areas, at least from an accounting perspective, where you are applying judgment, okay, and acknowledge it. So if you're given a premium that is small in context to the exposure that this put option is exposing Limpros to, right, you can note it. This consideration is small. You can also further note that, but IFRS 9 does not define what small is in the standard, but typically an option premium would meet the criteria or would meet the threshold, right? So outlining that point are those sort of HC points typically where you acknowledge that you're applying some judgment here, or you're acknowledging that if it doesn't actually define a particular standard, so I'm going to apply some judgment in making a conclusion one way or another, right? Then there's a requirement that says settled in future. Right, this we can apply, right, because we have the information, right? the put is only exercisable by ACP after a period of time. Okay, so you can apply that one. And then the value fluctuates in response to changes in the value of an underlying. Okay, now this one would need the exercise price to make that conclusion, which we do not have, right? So I'm gonna leave that to you to think about, and we'll talk about it a little bit more on the day. Why is the exercise price important for us to conclude whether or not the value of this contract fluctuates in response to changes in the value of an underlying, right? When thinking through this, first of all, you need to identify what the underlying is, and then think about why is the exercise important? Why do I need to know the exercise price to conclude on this requirement of a derivative? Okay, so I'm going to leave that in your court to think about. But now, what's important to also discuss is, what if it's not a derivative, right? Your thinking and your research needs to consider that too. So I speak about considering alternatives, right? What if I'm getting information in this way, so I conclude derivative? But then what if I'm given information in that way and I conclude that it's not a derivative? Then what is it? Okay, then you continue with the definitions, right? Try the definition of financial liability. Try the definition of a financial asset. You need to get used to or better at, right, classifying contracts. Gone are the days in ITC where the required will say, discuss in accordance with IFRS 9 whether or not the contract is a derivative, right? Those days are gone. At APC level, you need to be comfortable with seeing a set of facts and circumstances and deciding for yourself, what standard am I going to use to try and account for this accounting phenomenon? How do you decide? You use the definitions, right? For instance, you look at the T's and C's, and then you ask yourself, is this thing a lease? Okay. The way to answer that question, apply the definition of a lease, right? Then that, if it is, then it's a lease. If it's not, then it's not. Is this a revenue contract, a contract with a customer? Apply the definition of a revenue contract with a customer. Are you in or are you out? Is this a joint arrangement? Apply the definition of a joint arrangement. Are you in or are you out of IFRS 11? Is this a derivative? Okay, try IFRS 9. If not, is this a financial liability? Try IS 32 definition of financial liability. So, of course, when you see a contract like this, your first concern isn't the lease, right? I'm just using it as an example, right? But the activity or the exercise of trying to scope a transaction into a standard now rests with you. So you need to be comfortable. And once you've done applying all the definitions to determine which standard you're in, you need to also consider the scope, right? Because you could meet the definition of something, but it's scoped out of the standard. So you need to go somewhere else. Okay, so be careful with the scope. So if not a derivative, right, the next logical thing, at least for me, would be then to consider whether or not you have a financial liability here or you have some sort of financial asset. Again, how do you know? Apply the definitions. And to the extent that you can, okay, in the information that you have. And do you meet the definition or do you not meet the definition? Okay, so just a little bit of an outline then in terms of your thought process, in terms of how your research should work, right? Where you considering different alternatives, apply to the extent that you can, and then consider different alternatives. I have not yet received a term sheet from ACP with more detail, but in the meantime, please apply your mind to the above options and we can discuss later, right? So that's the management, accounting, and finance trigger. Also, start thinking about the key accounting implications for Limpros investing in Newco. Now, accounting implications is extremely broad, right? I just want to highlight that. Okay, if a trigger says accounting implications, this is extremely broad. Okay, remember to always consider definitions, the scope, initial recognition, initial measurement, subsequent measurement, derecognition, presentation and disclosure of any applicable standard. Okay, so always be extremely cautious about this. And to be completely honest, again, this would also scope in deferred tax. Okay, because IAS 12 is an accounting concept. Okay, so accounting implications would even scope in deferred tax. So it's an extremely broad trigger that we have here. And I think I may have mentioned this in the first screencast, right? We've got balance in this case study. We've got one task A trigger for accounting, that includes copious amounts of information that we can work through and think about and apply. We can go in as far as even trying as far as we can to impair or do the IFRS 5 impairments or the calculations for the IFRS 5 remeasurement and reclassification to the extent that we can. They have some sort of framework or structure in terms of how we go about doing it. That's how much information we had in task A. Task D, extremely broad, right? Very little information that we've been given in the pre-release information. So very little application that we can do. So we have to rely on our imagination a little bit. Okay. Firstly, to ensure that our research and our revision is as broad as possible, right? Covering all the fundamentals of the standard, right? Not stressing too much about the technical complexities, the nuanced, specific considerations in the standard. Like in IFRS 10, I gave the example of the asset manager guidance, right? That's quite specific and technical, right? With a broad trigger like this, keep it to the basics, keep it to the fundamentals. You can use your ITC syllabus as a bit of a guide in terms of what the fundamentals are when sort of doing your research. But again, broad fundamentals, right? Where you have a trigger like this, accounting implications, and you have very high level, so keep it to the fundamentals where you have very high level information, like the paragraph here, and a reminder that accounting implications is quite broad, right? And it's throughout it's throughout IFRS, right? All IFRSs that are in your books, and throughout all the possible sections that could be applicable in terms of each specific standard. Okay. So not a very long screencast for task D, because there isn't much information to go over, but a lot of information to revise, in your preparation for responding to task D. Okay, thank you so much for joining me on the screencast. I really look forward to meeting you all I say face to face, but just on camera later on this week, where we'll be unpacking the IOD of both task A and task D, and we'll just be speaking through what the expectation is from a competent candidate as we go along. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day further.